Hello and welcome back to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a variety of different mediums. The only rule
And
is that
borders.
those two. The, the only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of those stories. Things like game mechanics, acting, animation, all of that sort of thing are off limits unless they directly relate to the way a narrative is being presented. My name is Daniel Radford, author, mundane individual, and also your host, and I am once again joined by John Kernan as we begin our second cycle of episodes, this time focusing on a theme of magic.
Magic is fun.
It's a lot of things, but fun is first and foremost amongst them.
Yes.
It's actually kind of appropriate to say that it is a lot of things because I feel like that is the most true statement we could possibly have led off with. Because
Magic is so many things that in some worlds, magic is just science, even though normally the whole point of magic is to directly go beyond science.
exactly, it's like, despite the fact that magic is the fantasy writer's bread and butter, uh, it is also, as a concept, extremely poorly defined because it can be effectively anything. Even
Yep,
things that aren't called magic. Um,
it's true. And the term magic system is even more itself generalized because there are a lot of stories you could argue have a magic system despite having no magic.
yeah, I mean, the way I
Bending
typically,
in Avatar is not magic, but it's a magic system.
it's exactly, that's one of my go-to examples. The way I typically look at it is that the difference between magic and a magic system is more of an in-universe thing than a technical difference, like at a literary level. Um, something that we as the audience recognize as magic isn't necessarily going to be classified as such in universe.
No,
Um,
because the funny thing about the word magic is despite magic, as far as we know, not being something that exists in the real world, it's more a real world term than anything else anytime we use it. Because when you call something magic, unless you have to call it that, because that's explicitly what the universe calls it, you're not calling it magic because it's magic by the fictional universe's definition. You're calling it magic because it's something that we couldn't do in the real world.
yeah, exactly. Like I personally tend to just define magic as a concept as the ability to break the like typical laws of reality and physics as we know them. I
Yeah.
think anything beyond that sort of definition is incredibly difficult from a classification sense because it's such a broad sort of aspect of storytelling and mythoses and all that.
In fact, that's another lovely trait of one of the core things that makes something magic is not being so clearly definable.
Yeah, I mean that's a good call. I think in a lot of the settings that identify magic as magic, it's typically the ones where it is a more broad thing, as opposed to something that exists within a very narrow set of rules.
Yeah, and even when magic has a much clearer set of rules, there's always things about it that defy definition to the point where I would say like defying definition, at least in some areas, is almost a core aspect of magic being magic.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a universal rule. I think a good example of something that's kind of an outlier there is the Force from Star Wars, because it is quite explicitly not magic in universe, but it is also such a broad magic system that basically anything can happen under its umbrella, and you'll go, yeah, right.
Yeah, I know one guy who ate a planet.
Case in point, uh, in the expanded universe of lore, I don't know how canon it is anymore. That happened at one point.
Yeah, yeah, he is. That guy's that guy's pretty intense.
Well, yeah, you have to be fairly intense to go out for brunch and consume Saturn.
Oh, I mean, there were a lot of tasty Jedi snacks with all sorts of force energy on that planet, and he was feeling really hungry. He's always really hungry, to the point where you could almost say that's all he is.
And there we have it, the prime example of magic can be anything.
Yep.
Sometimes it's an appetite.
Imagine imagine if your magic power was having magic that matches one of your personality traits. It just so happens that that personality trait is one of the seven deadly sins.
Honestly,
He's basically if the Force consumed a being of pure gluttony and then became pure gluttony within them until that was just all they were, is basically an avatar of gluttony itself. Consume.
it's funny you say that. One of the magic systems I'm currently working on for something is effectively that conceptualized. The idea of your magic being a direct parallel of who you are as a person.
There are a lot of stories who go out of their way to do that with at least certain characters, even without it being a trait of the system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean it's a very common thing for a like where a character fits into their magic system to be reflective of their role in the story, or just symbolic of them of their personality. Like the person with fire powers is almost always someone with anger issues.
And the person with fire powers who doesn't have anger issues will have blue fire instead and be a cold, calculating psychopath who needs to be stopped. Not thinking of any particular examples here or
No,
anything,
no.
Azula.
Now that I think about it as well, I think in fantasy books as well, like if we were to do a comparison, I think you get a lot more of the broad kind of magic in books compared to visual media. I don't know why that is.
It's tough to say. I think I think in books it's actually easier instead of harder for magic systems to become a writing crutch actually, because when you have to actually visualize forms of magic and put them on screen, you have to do more to justify it and have the audience understand it, because it's a lot easier for it to literally look like someone waving their hands and making things go the way they want. Whereas the very fact that you're like describing it in a book, I think makes the suspension of disbelief on the audience's part a lot easier, but easier to the point where a lot of writers, um, instead of over explaining, will under explain their magic system and give it a feeling of, yeah, it just kind of works this way.
I mean, some systems it really is, well, they just work this way.
Yeah, yeah, no, but conversely, a lot of the systems you see that are like that because a writer still put a lot of work into it. Like you can make it just works this way feel good, but you have to have put just as much thought into why and how on a meta level it just works this way, because then it hits the audience the right way and they can still feel good about it and feel like it doesn't just work this way because it's out of nowhere. It just works this way because it's like a part of the fabric of reality in this reality. It's essentially a part of nature. And there's a lot of stuff about nature that like we can learn and understand it on a scientific level, sometimes even down to like the molecular level, but all there's still also no greater reason it works the way it does. It works that way because it works that way. That's the rules nature have given us. That's the course things have taken and evolved and developed down. And it happens like that.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what form your magic system takes. If it exists, it's going to be deeply ingrained in your world. Whether it is something mysterious and mystical that no one understands, or if it is something that's basically science, there's no way that it's not going to just be very integrated into, at the very least, society. Whether that's a good thing or not will depend on the writer, but
Yeah. No, it's stuff like that is fun. Not to not to reference Avatar again, but it's just so easy because it's so good. Um, Kind of reminds me of the of one of my favorite quotes from Avatar, which is when they're in the town with the little fortune teller, where the town practically worships her, and Sokka explains that something happens the way it does because of science, and it's just like, yeah, science has solved a lot of problems, and the person's like, oh yeah, can your science explain why it rains? And he just goes, yes, yes, it can.
I mean, it's such a funny example as well, though, because that's a perfect example of uh magic as a concept being a more external than internal thing to a story. Because this is also a world where people can wave their hands and like produce flames or change air currents with the power of their mind. But at the same
Yeah,
time,
so you
there are
can more
still
easily
people who are
understand.
skeptical of fortune telling.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a funny thing because like the world's not as scientifically developed as ours, but they never use bending or how common it is as an excuse to not develop things like science. In fact, what they do instead, which I think is very important to these worlds, is as it always obvious would in a place like this, the natural magic system of the world, the thing that sets the world apart from ours on a natural level, incorporates into science. What's the nation with the best use of metal and all that? Fire Nation. Why? It's easy for them to melt and process metal and gather materials with that metal and then also process those materials like turning trees into charcoal to burn for fuel and all sorts of other things. Like,
And they also just have it effectively not quite limitless because people get tired, but a effectively limitless supply of heat to and flames to actually burn that fuel in the first place. Yeah.
and then like once we advance further down that thing, what's another thing that happens? People do things like charge batteries and help power plants flow with lightning bending.
Yeah.
Like that stuff always has to factor in, and I love that there's that going on. But there's also still typical science stuff. You've got a guy learning how to make cars. You've got Sokka over there knowing why it rains. And then you've got uh lady throwing knuckle bones and telling the future.
And everyone just knows it's bullshit because according to the laws of their world, that is magic in quotation marks and therefore not real.
Whereas bending, while magic to us, is just a natural part of that world. In fact, it's the most natural part of that world.
That's a clear sign of a magic system that is done well, is when it is just seamlessly integrated into that world where it feels and is a natural thing for that world.
Gotta love it.
Even even in the sense that some people could see someone like doing magic and being like, wow, that's impressive. It's not impressive because how the hell are you doing that? It's impressive because they're good at it. Or it's a
Yeah,
rare ability.
they have skill or talent at a thing that's a part of the world.
Yeah, I think that's granted. This is a book series I have not read in a while, um, but growing up, I was really into a book called, well, a series of books. I think it's like called the Bartimaeus trilogy or something like that. So,
That name sounds familiar.
and the first book's called The Amulet of Samarkand.
I've
Um,
definitely heard that name. Even if I don't recognize the rest of the series, I have heard of the Amulet of Samarkand.
it's genuinely really good, but there's always this. It's never exactly explicitly clear how aware the world is that there are magicians summoning demons in it, because there is like, I mean, they're antagonistic at first. I believe, for memory, they become somewhat less so. But there's like a faction who is very anti-magician, of like rebel kids, basically.
Yeah, I mean,
But
I probably wouldn't be a
it's
fan
never
of people
clear.
summoning
I
demons.
don't think it's ever made clear if everyone happens to know about this, that like half the government magicians who have demons working under them, or like that there is these cadres of magicians running the world, basically, or if it's, I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've like read the books, so maybe I'm misremembering. But I feel like I distinctly remember being a little bit confused as to whether it just happened that these people had stumbled upon a secret, or if I had missed it earlier on, and just everyone happens to know about the world working this way.
I wouldn't be surprised if you remember that fairly accurately, because that's actually a pretty common thing I see with a lot of stories that are really like focused on great or larger than life or just extremely consequential things to the world is sometimes writers forget to give us the context for why what's going on isn't normal in that world. And a lot of times people can get away with it because what they're showing is already not normal in the context of the real world. But I think an important part of world building is to give in universe context. Like the the readers should have an idea, at least after they've read, more than just an early chunk, should have some concept of what is normal for that world and what makes what's going on extraordinary and why.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the big problems I have with like secret magic societies and things like that, where it's often like, how are they keeping this secret when there is just bona fide mystical shit existing out in the common world as well? Like, I, you have to be able to give a real good reason for why people don't know that this is a thing. Weirdly, I think one of the best examples of doing it right, I mean, not weirdly, but it's probably not something that people consider very often, is the Narnia books.
Oh man, one of the things I actually really like about most of the Chronicles of Narnia books is they give you tons of context for like what the regular life is like. Like outside of certain books in the I think I want to say like two books in the series where the greater society at large isn't relevant for fairly legitimate reasons. Because one of the books has the creation of the world itself. Spoilers.
That is the first book, I believe.
Yes,
Which, I mean,
but
it makes sense since there's so many biblical references that it starts with Genesis and ends with
if
Exodus.
if I remember right though, I think that's chronological order, not release order, because I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe might genuinely be the first
You
of the books
might be
released.
right,
But
because the first book
whatever.
is The Magician's Nephew, and I read them in chronological order, so that's the
I
order
did
I'm
too
familiar
because I
with.
got
Box
I
set?
as a gift, I got a not even a box set, is this massive paperback that was just all 7 books.
Oh God, I had the, wasn't even technically mine, it was my uncle's,
Yeah,
I
you can
believe.
guess how hard that thing was to maintain. I tried to take good care of it, but it fell apart. It was too much book to be paperback. But before I sidetrack myself too much, I think Narnia is actually one of the most like fundamentally well realized worlds in like all of fiction. Like anybody who's read the Chronicles of Narnia books could like just pick any of the nations we've spent time in that world, especially just Narnia itself, and you could easily just imagine the path of multiple days for like normal regular people there and what would go on from day to day and what's different about it from reality and all that. And like that's why I love that one of the Chronicles of Narnia books literally just exists to explore other parts of the world outside of Narnia, and that's all the book is. The book is just a collection of characters who were main characters in other books and are instead part of a crew here, getting on a big special boat and just going. It's just, hey, let's explore all the different. And it may as well just be a collection of short stories, because um one of the things I love about Narnia as a world that, like, you don't see in a lot of fictional worlds, because it's hard to pull off well, and even in the areas it's not incredibly hard to pull off. It takes, how do I put it? I want to say it takes a special kind of mind from the writer, because you have to have a firm idea of what your world is, but also lack a rigid definition of what it's supposed to be, because
Yeah,
Narnia has laws of physics. Narnia has things it's supposed to be, but also there is intentionally so much less consistency between different parts of the world of Narnia than we have in the real world. If you go across the world on Earth, that other country over there with a completely different society still follows the same laws of physics and nature that wherever you grew up does. Not in Narnia. You go across the world in Narnia, that island over there, that could be an island where everybody is born invisible.
yeah. I mean, it's one of those settings where it's one of the very vague magic settings, right? Where magic could be anything. It is no real rules or definition given to the magic of that world, but the world itself, it's so integrated with the world, and the world is constructed in such a way that it gives the illusion that there is structure where there isn't any.
Something I love about that is the term magic could be anything just becomes nature can be anything. Like, you go to an unexplored, uncharted land in the world of Narnia, and you could find anything waiting for you. I mean, fuck, like, spoilers for one of the oldest and most well known stories in all of fiction. Chronicles of Narnia has, like, an underground kingdom with, or not even kingdom, it has an underground world with crazy bug creatures and, like, sad little goblin people, and a mixture of Father Time and the Titan Kronos, who just is huge and has a massive white beard and is asleep forever. Father Time's just sleeping down there somewhere. He's hanging out. He's not going to wake up until the end of the world.
That is, I vaguely remember that. Yeah,
Yeah, he's just there.
it's just there. It's one of those things that just like lends credence to the to that illusion of structure. Is that that seems like a normal important thing,
Yeah,
and
just
it's
one of the base avatars of an aspect of nature in the world itself is he's napping.
it's something that C.S. Lewis did Narnia, right?
Yep,
Yeah,
that was C.S.
yeah,
Lewis.
was something that Lewis did really well that a lot of other writers have tried to replicate since and not achieved nearly as well. Is uh, a super vague magic system that doesn't feel vague and that doesn't necessarily break down under the slightest bit of scrutiny because of its vagueness.
Yeah, because it's vague, but it's intentionally vague, not unthought out vague.
Yeah, definitely a distinct difference.
And it works perfectly that it's vague too, because other than one or two books, for the most part, the presentation of the Chronicles of Narnia stories is as if it was a bedtime story.
Yeah,
Despite having
we've talked
long
about
form
this.
and a defined world, I part of why I love it is I think I want to read I think I want to try actually reading the Chronicles of Narnia as bedtime stories. Like, if I have kids one day, I think I want to legitimately actually, like, read the book out loud to them and see how that feels, cuz that's how he wrote it for his niece or granddaughter, I can't remember which, Lucy.
Yeah, I think it was actually was it last episode we talked about this?
I know we at least
Yeah, we
mentioned it before. I
definitely
remember
touched on
going
it.
off about it a little bit.
Um, but yeah, it's Narnia is it's a great example of a world with a well done soft magic system, of which frankly I don't think many exist. Um,
Yeah.
there is my hot take for the episode. Uh,
The Chronicles of Narnia is one of the few really famous, well-known stories that I would actually still call a fair bit underrated. Not because I think it's so good it should be more popular than it was, so much as it's kind of faded into obscurity a little bit, despite what a fundamental like pillar of fiction it is. Um, and I think part of what's to blame for that is that they bothered to adapt it into multiple movies without the movies having the same flow as the books or really matching them that well.
or being good in any conceivable way.
I enjoyed The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe a lot, but it's one of the rare cases of me enjoying a movie and then not enjoying the next movie nearly as much, and going back and reading the books after having seen the movies and going, "Oh, these are a lot better than the movie."
Um,
And and that sucks because I think a lot of people who might have read the books didn't because of the movies.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it is weird that it's not talked about like nearly as much as say The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because it's kind of the other pillar of contemporary fantasy
And
in a
if I
lot of
remember right,
ways.
I might have Tolkien mixed up with someone else. I'm pretty sure
They knew
Tolkien
each
and
other,
Lewis
yeah.
were friends.
They were friends, I believe, yes.
They
Um,
uh they talked about their different stories a lot because the
they,
two men had a decent amount in common, but had very different ideas for what their worlds to be. But interestingly enough, they both factored in a certain amount of nuanced take on Christian fundamentalism because both men were pretty Christian, which, of course most people would be back in the time. These guys are old. But
whether they wanted to be or
in
not.
into their stories in different ways. Obviously, the Christian influences in Lord of the Rings are much much more subtle than Chronicles of Narnia because Chronicles of Narnia just has Lion Jesus.
And also Genesis and Exodus.
And yeah, yeah, it does have Genesis and Exodus. I mean, it's it has its own heaven for Christ's sake. Pun half intended.
It's actually really funny that we've gone off on Narnia so much because I was not expecting to talk about like a soft magic world nearly as much, seeing as it's generally not my thing and I lean more into magic systems with structure and rules because I find that soft systems are they can be good, but they rarely are, and it's just too
Soft
easy.
magic systems are harder to pull off well than hard magic systems. It's a lot easier to have rules.
Yeah, for clarification, for anyone listening who uh, doesn't know, when we say soft magic systems and hard systems, it's literally just soft magic systems are the more vague, poorly defined magic systems we talked about, where magic is just magic. It can be basically anything. Compared to hard magic systems, which is still magic, or at least a magic system, but it has a much more rigid set of rules that it has to follow into.
Yeah. And I'm actually kind of glad we came on Narnia because I think that thing I was talking about with different like countries and continents in that world having entirely different rules and laws of physics and all that stuff is actually a good example of what sets a soft magic system apart from a hard magic system, and why I think soft magic is harder to do well is if you want to do soft magic well, you actually still have to come up with rules. But it's like instead of coming up with one or two or a couple well defined sets of rules, you have to come up with a lot of small sets of rules because in a soft magic system, generally it instead of there not really being any rules, the good ones a lot of times instead have a bunch of little aspects that have their own smaller sets of rules that aren't necessarily connected to everything else. Like how I mentioned that one island having its own entire set of rules for how the world works. It's a similar thing with like the soft magic. You could do something like there's a lot of rules to how this one school or this one type of magic works. Somebody who's gonna follow or summon a demon, or yeah, it's someone who's gonna summon a demon might do this, like this and this, but it doesn't work as that same guy over there who's flinging fireballs and lightning bolts and has mana and is getting tired and all this stuff. You can't just like, I don't know. I'm overly defining soft magic by the very nature of what a soft magic system is. But I think that's part of the thing is even though you don't define all those things for the audience, they still have to have rules and you still have to think of it if you want it to be good. Otherwise, it's just vague stuff. You're essentially hand waving.
I
It
think
may as well just be a plot contrivance.
I think it's less that you need a lot of specific rules and more that you need to know where the upper limit is.
There has to be an underlying logic that's still guiding it despite the rules, or despite the lack of rules, I mean.
It's a Yeah,
And,
kind of.
that's something the author has to keep track of. It's an author's responsibility even when it's not being communicated to the audience.
Yeah, in my eyes, it's more like you need to know what is and isn't possible for a soft magic still, more than you need like rules beyond that. Because if you don't have a limit on what is possible, you find yourself in a very bad situation for a writer to be in, which is you completely lose all your stakes in your story because magic can just solve every problem, and that's not good. You don't want to be in that situation. Uh, Alternatively, you end up in the situation where you've created a world where theoretically magic can solve any problem, and then it doesn't, and your audience are confused as to why. And when I say confused, I mean pissed.
You know what I think is a lovely example of a world with a fairly soft magic system, despite it literally being science in that world, that immediately right away shows us one of the limits of the soft magic, one of the things it can't do.
I'm sure you're about to tell me.
Full Metal Alchemist.
You see, I had a hunch you were about to say that, and I hard disagree that that is a soft magic system.
There's a lot of stuff in it that's not very clearly defined. That we're just told that it all works with magic. Like scars, tattoos, what they can do, we understand.
It makes
Why
sense.
why is scientific
How
details that we can't understand?
Yeah, I mean it's the how you gain the ability to do alchemy in that setting is left vague. You could consider that soft, I suppose, but the way that the power system actually works is very rigidly and clearly defined.
Yeah, but it's clearly defined by us being told like because some of it just boils down to, oh yeah, they found like the right combination of scientific equations to be able to essentially write down a guide for the power to make it work the way it works. Like Scar's arm just deconstructs things. Kimberly makes things explode. Some of them are a lot less clear than things like Mustang making a spark and then being able to control flames. And
I mean,
I
he doesn't really
definitely think
he doesn't really
it's not as
control
rigidly
flames. He just
defined as
makes
all
them.
that
I think
because one of the things we're told explicitly in Full Metal Alchemist is that the world doesn't have as clearly defined rules and limits as alchemy would have us think, and that nothing is impossible.
You see, I still don't know about that, right? I can see where you're coming from. I don't think it's the hardest of hard magic systems, but I would still definitely file away more in hard than soft because basically it is a magic system where everything is determined by value, not in the sense of like monetary worth, because that magic systems that work on that are a whole other can of worms that makes no sense if you really look into it. But everything has to be equivalent. Everything, every time you give something, it has to be made from or taken from, and roughly, not even roughly, a precisely equal amount of something else. You can't make something out of nothing. You have to reshape something that already exists. And the one thing in that world that seems to explicitly in universe break that rule is still powered by something of just an incredible amount of value, and that can still be used up.
One of the things I enjoy about Full Metal Alchemist, though, is while on its face it's telling us all this stuff about equivalent exchange, narratively it also goes out of its way to dispute equivalent exchange and say that there are ways to get more out than what you put in. It's not always just as simple as an equation.
I still don't know if I agree with that, because like even the in-universe example of Philosopher's Stones that in-universe appear to explicitly break the rules of equivalency, they don't actually, because
Well,
they
yeah,
are powered by
Philosopher's Stones don't.
souls, which are
But that's because Philosopher's Stones are supposed to be like, they're supposed to be a Faustian bargain. They're supposed to be a lie. They're not what they appear. But like, there are other things that are. I mean, hell, Al isn't equivalent exchange. For the cost of an arm, he kept a soul tethered to the world and alive through just a little bit of blood. I don't think that's equivalent exchange. I don't think an arm is equal to a soul.
true, but he wasn't making a soul. He was just binding it to something else. It's not like he recreated life, which is, as we know, explicitly something that you aren't supposed to be able to do unless you are feeding souls into it with a stone.
Well, yeah, I mean, because that's not quite creating life. That's transmuting life into a different kind of life,
Yeah, and that that's
really,
that
which
that see that's exactly why I
on its
think
own is a no-no.
that's exactly why I think it is, again, maybe not like 100% the hardest magic system ever, but it definitely is a hard magic system and not a soft, is because everything is just changing something into something else. Always. And
Soft,
always.
soft maybe isn't the word I should have used, but I would definitely call it flexible. In fact, I think from now on, I'm gonna call alchemy and Full Metal Alchemist muscle magic because it's both hard and flexible and springy.
I mean, flexible and non-flexible is an entirely different vector that's different from hard and soft. Because you can have a magic system that is very rigidly defined, but still extremely flexible, like alchemy in Full Metal Alchemist. Or you can have soft magic systems that are not flexible at all, but are still super vaguely defined, like the
Mention the softness
aforementioned
because
Avatar.
because I think Full Metal Alchemist both tells us that alchemy has a lot of rules and definitions for how it works, but also not everything about alchemy is defined or as strict as it was meant to be, which is part of why we come to all the stuff I'm not going to say because spoilers for one of my favorite stories, yada yada, about the truth behind it all and all that stuff.
Yeah,
But man,
but
Full Metal Alchemist is good.
you have inadvertently touched on something though, which is the misconception, I think, that hard and soft and flexible and rigid are the same thing.
Oh yeah, they're absolutely not.
They're definitely not, and I'm not as well versed, interestingly enough, I suppose, on that segment of the graph on that axis. Um, but I feel like a flexible system is it will work fine under both hard and soft umbrellas, but a rigid system falls apart really quickly when you make it soft.
A rigid system essentially has to be hard because the whole thing about rigid is like
Except
it
for certain other examples that we've already given because Avatar is fantastic.
I would say, but Avatar's not rigid.
Exactly, but it's a soft system. Well, it is kind of rigid. There's very clear limits as like very clear specific kinds of magic that exist, even if the like way any of it works is really vaguely defined.
But like it's extremely flexible. You know, Toph is a perfect example of that. Like, yeah, she's an earthbender. She's an earthbender. Would do all those things, but then, you know, it's not just like anything that in a way is a part of the earth to a point. Like can be bent by an earthbender, you know, and she eventually bends metal and like, oh my god. And then you've got the other guys who
Yeah, but
bend
here,
sand.
here's the thing, and this is one of the things I really like, and I like about a lot of more rigid or harder magic systems in general, is that that's not cool because it's flexible. It's cool because she's doing something that no one has thought was possible, but still within the rigidity of that system. It's creative, which is what makes it impressive, because the way she goes about it isn't just suddenly I can manipulate metal, it's there's chunks of impurities in most metals,
Well,
and
that's
I
what I
can
mean. I would
manipulate
say that
those to
then is
manipulate the
like,
metal, which
I,
that's still, I feel, rigidity, it's just operating well within the system. And I
but
love it
that's
when
why I
stories
call
do
it
that.
flexible because it is within the system, but like she's flexing it because it's not something that was possible to people's understanding. It doesn't fit within what people thought the rules were. But she was able to sort of flex and bend within that and be like, well, it's still earth. Metal is a part of the earth, an aspect of the earth and comes from it. It's just much more refined.
Yeah, I can see why you would think that. I'm not gonna spend another 20 minutes debating that one like we did Full Metal. uh,
Well, I think another good
but
aspect of that is lightning bending. Lightning is just straight up not fire.
yeah, I mean, I think I've registered my complaints about that to you before. I think that is a very good example of more on the flexibility side, or just more on the soft side, even more than anything, because it doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think it makes sense in the way that like more than any other element, controlling fire is controlling energy.
Yeah, I can see why you would do that, but that almost pushes it back into rigid territory. Um, I think I can definitely. It's one of those things where like the axes get a little blurred because I still think that that's more of a soft thing than a rigidity thing. But I can. It's one of those systems that could very easily be read either way, I suppose. So I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do see where you're coming from with that
No,
one.
I mean, I would say bending is it's kind of like Kirby. It's soft and flexible and incredibly powerful. Not always as cute though.
Right, where were we? Right, soft and hard system. I mean, and flexible. I mean, those axes as well, though. Like, there is so many other ways that you can define a magic system on top of that.
Oh yeah.
Uh, like you have elemental systems that Avatar again falls into that. But even inside that, you have like extra categories because you have the standard, fire, water, earth, air, Greek, I believe, uh, like classic elements,
Ah
or
yes. Greek, my favorite element.
oh boy. Um, or the very similar sort of Chinese classic elements, which take those but then add in like metal and or wood.
I'm a
Or
wood dog in the Chinese zodiac.
or you'll get like a system of five elements, but they'll add a fifth. They'll like make lightning its own thing, or they'll add some like vague universal aether or something to it. Although real talk about elemental systems, something that drives me absolutely mad about so many of them is when they take ice and make it a separate element other than water.
Well, ice is cold, you see.
Water can be cold. They are the
Yeah,
same thing.
but it can't be that cold before it becomes ice.
It can if it's salt water.
Salt water can still freeze.
It can.
That's how you get your nice little salty ice pops. Cows love it.
But yeah, that's a
In
personal pet
fact,
peeve of mine.
Kingdom Hearts
Oh no.
loves sea salt in ice cream.
Oh, don't start with me about Kingdom Hearts. I don't understand it. Um,
It's the bluest thing I've ever seen. That's all I know.
yeah, it's the same thing. Stop making water and ice separate. Literally, chemically, not different. Um, you have, but beyond that elemental system, you got divine systems, which magic comes from the gods or from like a warlock patron or whatever. Is I feel like that's arguably the oldest kind of magic system because it's the one that you generally find in mythology.
True.
Is that a lot of like magic in myths is just because they're a god and they can because they're the embodiment of X or they
Oh,
or
like Apocalypse from the X-Men. Yes, the embodiment of X. My favorite.
I should have seen that coming. I'm not even a comic book guy, but I should have seen that coming.
I
um
mean, it's just he is an interesting example of that because his whole thing is essentially he's so powerful as a mutant. He's almost kind of like the god of mutants.
Kinda, yeah.
Ancient, primordial, yet still fits the definition of what a mutant is, despite being able to do crazy, crazy
I mean he's
things that,
supposedly the like progenitor of mutants, right?
yeah, he is kind of, yeah, he is essentially like the first mutant
Which
and
it's
looks a lot like
actually
Darkseid.
it's actually now that I think about it kind of funny um that the comic series that's all about evolution subverts itself unintentionally by making the most powerful mutant the original
Yeah.
because that completely flies in the face of I mean, not exactly because it's not really how evolution works, but the like layman's understanding of evolution.
Yeah, generally you expect evolution to mean things improve overall over time.
Yeah, which it's not necessarily how it works truthfully in reality,
Nope. And I mean,
but
some creatures go extinct specifically because they evolved wrong.
yeah, but in the
Sometimes evolution just fucks up.
but in the context of this story, where superpowers are the next step of evolution, it's a little bit backwards that the first one is the most powerful one.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Although, in a way, it also makes sense because with how evolution works, something like the mutations of mutants.
Could be getting
sh-
diluted over
Well,
time or
not just
something.
that. It has to have like come from somewhere. There has to have been somebody who mutated in the way that it could be construed as superpowers first.
I mean, that's the guy.
Because, it it's not the kind of thing that by very virtue of making it like a genetic evolutionary thing, it's not something that could just happen to a whole group of people at once and then go unnoticed for a while. It has to have sprang from somewhere. So it makes sense he's the progenitor. It's just a little weird that he's stronger than almost all the others except for Jean Grey and the Phoenix Force, but we don't need to talk about that. That's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I mean, comic books have never. Speaking of soft magic systems, comic books have never been one for sticking to any like defined rules.
What are you trying to tell me? The fact that there's a story where Superman sneezed a nebula out of existence is mildly out of line with that time Kryptonite allowed Batman to punch him.
Um, weirdly, no, actually, that example. Um,
No, because I mean, there are other stories where he's like survived being impaled on a spear of kryptonite and that type
yeah,
of thing. Like, comic books aren't consistent.
but it's interesting you bring up superheroes because a story that I'm very fond of, and called Worm, and also its sequel
You're
Ward.
fond of horror. I've never heard you mention it before. This is weird.
Well, the audience didn't know, so fuck you. Um,
Yeah, well, the audience doesn't know a lot of things.
um, but they that story. I know you're not super familiar with it, and I don't want to spoil it because I'm determined to make you actually watch it at some point. Watch it, read it. I mean, at some point.
I
Um,
definitely will.
but they do the thing that like with that the X-Men does, sort of. It's not genetic is part of it, but they do this idea of the source being way more powerful than subsequent subsequent iterations of the power. They do it much better, and in a way that is like deeply woven into the world building. It's fantastic, but it's also a subversion of itself because powers are in universe seemingly getting stronger. But one of the one of the things about that universe and the way and its world building and everything is that people don't know where powers come from, and unraveling that mystery is really important to not just the story as a whole, but also to a lot of characters and their investments and interests. Go read Worm, guys. It's a web serial. It's free. Just Google it.
It's supposed to be really good. Y'all should probably read it.
It's just really, really long.
And don't spoil anything for me, because if you do, I'll break your fingers.
Yeah, he's crazy. He'll do it. Um, but yeah, it's and the whole genetic magic or not genetic, like that's just another kind of classification you can have because it can be innate or learned as two different systems. Sometimes a little of both. Um, there's just so many ways to do magic, and that's kind of one of the cool things about it is that there's no way to really do it wrong.
The
You
only
can
way,
you can do
the
it.
only real way to do magic wrong is to like, well, I guess even then, that becomes less doing magic wrong and more doing world building or your basic writing
Yeah,
wrong.
I was
But
gonna say
like,
you can do it badly because you can do things like breaking your own rules or not defining things in your system that is
or
trying to define
implementing it in a way
things,
that hurts the narrative instead of contributing to it.
or breaking your narrative or leaving plot holes, all these things. You can definitely do magic badly, but you can't do it wrong. There's no
That's true.
like defined way you should conceptualize your magic systems, and that's one of the things that makes fantasy such a rich and interesting genre. And also versatile because you can lean into different elements to make it scary or exciting or fascinating or any number of other things or any combination of other things.
It's true. Fantasy is quite rich. Fantasy writers make a lot of money.
That is not at all true. Some fantasy writers make a lot of money. Most do not. Most writers are quite poor.
Well, yeah, that's writing in general. I'm talking like the fantasy authors who get popular. Oh,
Oh
people
yeah.
pay for fantasy because fantasy is a lot more adaptable than most other forms of fiction.
I mean, it's in the name. It's a fantasy. It's the sort of things people wish they could do.
I wish I could be a character in a book.
Probably not one
That's
I've
part
written.
of why I want to voice act. Because
Depends on.
I'm gonna get to be characters in books whether anybody writes me into one or not.
It depends on. I think it depends on the book whether I'd want to be in it or not.
Well, yeah, you don't want to be in bad ones.
No, I mean not even bad from the writing standpoint, but in universe there are some places that I would not want to live.
Well, it's okay.
You do
You don't
not.
have to.
You
You
don't
don't have
want
to
me
live
as
in
your
the
god.
world. Someone's just writing into it.
Uh,
Man, imagine if parallel universes existed in a way that if somebody decided to write a book and just convert you into a character to put in that book, that would mean they're just one of the parallel realities was you having to live in that world. And anytime somebody wanted, they would inadvertently create a new reality where someone has to live the life they wrote out just by virtue of writing it.
it's it's really funny you say that because I think I don't really know the franchise, um, but I'm pretty sure that is actually how more or less the magic system of the Discworld books functions. I think the like quotation marks, or maybe not quotation marks, I'm not entirely sure, magic of Discworld actually functions based on like like runs on the power of stories and belief,
Yeah,
which
that's what
is
my world runs on. I love stories.
why it's batshit insane, but still works.
Hey,
I really need to like properly get into it. I mostly only know about it through osmosis, but everything I
Osmosis
hear,
Jones, I love him.
no, everything I hear about it makes me go, damn, that sounds really cool, and I should read it. But I never get around to it. To be fair, Terry Pratchett started writing them in like the 70s or 80s. I think it's the 80s, and there's like I think over 40 books now in the franchise because it's not like a series. It's just an interconnected like the literary equivalent of the MCU, but probably with fewer hiccups.
I prefer things to have fewer hiccups. I don't like hiccuping.
No one does.
As someone with acid reflux, I have a special pit of hate in my heart for hiccuping because I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but when your body tries to burp and hiccup at the same time, doesn't feel good.
Nope. No, it doesn't.
It
I
feels very bad.
I suffer a different kind of reflux, but I share your pain.
God, the worst one I ever had was a time where it literally felt like there were two different air bubbles in my chest crashing into each other, and essentially my heart. It felt like they were squeezing my chest.
Hear me out. Magic system, but the source of power is just gut health.
Ah, yes, a world all about infomercials for probiotics. I see.
The balance of bacteria in your stomach determines your superpowers. How fucked are you?
Mm. I want to say my gut biome might not be too bad, but I don't know. I do live in America.
This is the content people tune in for.
I, man, that's a world that would just
It would
really
suck.
not be kind to a lot of people.
It would be horrendous.
There would be one thing really funny about that world though, and that's vegans expecting to be really powerful and then not.
I mean, it does. We joke badly mostly, but it does touch on something really interesting to explore in like fantasy worlds or just any world in general with a magic system, and that is the like power disparity between those who have power and those who don't. I think that's something that the X-Men stories actually do approach really well. Is the like fear that people have of powers, because realistically, yeah, that shit would be terrifying if you were an ordinary person.
Yeah. You
Uh,
mean a guy whose eyes are just lasers all the time, and the only thing that can stop them is him having something reflective right in front of his eyes at all
or
times?
people
That's
who
pretty
can just
scary.
straight up invade your mind and manipulate you. Yeah, that like you, it's still not nice of the like anti-mutant people in the government and stuff like that, but you can very much understand where that fear is coming from, which does kind of make the parallels to like real world discrimination fall apart a little bit, but
You know who's one of those mutants we're just so lucky is a good guy is a Nightcrawler, because teleporting is already a crazy enough power. But the added context that when he teleports, he's not just poofing from one place to another, he's going into a parallel dimension where that essentially runs on a time scale that's so much faster than ours. Time may as well be frozen here, and then popping back into our world after moving through that one. Uh, really glad he's not evil, because he could just grab you, poof to that other world, and then leave you there. He does that to a villain that they can't beat. He teleports him to that world and leaves him there, and then for like the rest of the series until they find a way to deal with that character. Every single time he teleports, he's running away from that guy because that guy is still there, sees him pop back into that world, and is like, "Oh, come here, you little shit."
That's another thing, like handling that disparity is something Worm does really well as well, in a lot of interesting ways, because like politically the superhero agencies are managed by a non-powered government body as like a way to create the illusion of a power balance. But by the same token, the heroes are like constantly holding back because they can't afford not like because they if the public saw what they were really capable of doing and the way they handled the truly deadly threats, it would be disastrous for society because you would end
Like,
up with an
oh,
X-Men scenario basically.
oh, monsters. We're protected by monsters.
Exactly. It's second time today. Go read Worm. Just do it. I know it's long. I don't care. It's worth it, trust me.
Hey, a lot of good things are long. Phrasing.
You know,
I didn't mean it that way when I said it, but you can't call other people out if you can't call yourself out. Phrasing.
yeah, normally I would be considered to do you a favor and edit that out, but I'm not going to because usually the faux pas that we just have to leave in to keep the flow of an episode are mine. And I do the editing, so
Whatever.
I have the power here.
I don't want anything I say edited out. I'm no coward. Let's go.
Oh yeah, flip it back at me, dickhead. um,
That's part of how my sense of humor works. I gotta embrace the faux pas, the fapaux.
oh boy.
However you spell them fancy words, what with the letters and such.
But yeah, magic.
I like
And
magic.
magic systems as a tangent off that because they are functionally the same thing. They're just really cool. Like closing remarks. Magic is just fucking cool, guys.
Magic kicks ass. If you have magic in your local neighborhood, you should find a way to harness it today. And if you don't, you should write about it.
And if you do, maybe do figure out a way to harness it and then just tell me. I promise I'll use it for good.
That's I don't think that's a real promise.
Shut up. And on that note, that's where we're going to end this episode. We will see you guys next week when we dive into a more specific example of a magic based story when we figure out which one we're going to do.
And how we've both selfishly profited from the use of magic since this week.
Living the dream, that'll be. I already have. I mean, I'm gonna do nothing but good things.
Only good things. Make
Anyway,
society a better place, by my own definition of better.
exactly. No villain has ever said that.
Never. That's not a thing villains say. Villains do bad things,
Yeah,
not good things.
exactly. On that not at all disturbing note about our morality, you can find me on Twitter at DanielWright7, and you will see some other things from my tolerable co-host here soon.
Many people tolerate me.
And many of us don't.
Who are they? Tell me. I need to have conversations with them.
Wouldn't you like to know?
Friendly, innocent conversations.
Right, well, bye.